We're here today on the banks of the Cowlitz River with Michael Hubbs. Well, here we are at the site of the Plumondon cabin, and Michael, you had told us a little bit about this earlier. It's a pretty interesting and early cabin. Can you give us some of the background here?
Hey, Karen, we're here on the banks of the Cowlitz River, about 3 miles above Toledo, Cowlitz Landing area, and I understand this is known as Mission Bar.
Fur traders and suppliers coming up these benches of land to where we're standing now, which was the many thousand acres of land that the Hudson's Bay Company owned and operated as Cowlitz Farms.
We're at St. Xavier's Cemetery.
Good evening, folks. My name is Augustus Chatham, and I've been asked by some of the folks here in town to come and meet with you and tell you a little bit about the trail and what the trip is going to be like.
Hello, young lady. Are you learning to play the fiddle?
Oh yes, a neighbor's teaching me.
So here we are at Lewis and Clark State Park, south of Chehalis.
These are wagon ruts, very reminiscent of what you find on the old immigrant road.
Well, here we are in the interior of the Jackson Courthouse.
Karen, this old log house looks interesting. Can you tell us about who the owner was, the time period?
Well, we're inside the Lewis County Museum in Chehalis now. Well, here we are at Cloquedo. Cloquedo was a little town that was developed by the Davis family in the late 1840s, early 1850s.
So from here we're going to go to Centerville.
Okay. Well, here we are in the town of Centerville, or what is today known as Centralia. The town was started by a man by the name of George Washington, who started out from Virginia. He was born in 1817 and was what in those days was called a mulatto, half black, half white. He was actually given to a couple who brought him across the plains because his mother and father were not married. And once he got here to the future site of Centerville, he became a well-known man. He was very generous to other settlers, gave them food, loaned them equipment and seed so they could get started, and he was just a good town father. One of the documents that we found in the archives is a copy of a petition that was written in 1852, even before Washington was a territory. The men around here were so impressed with George Washington and his generosity that they wanted him to live here, because actually at that time there was a law in Oregon Territory that prevented a black man from living here. So 112 men of the area got together and asked the legislature in Oregon to allow George Washington to live here as a free man. And that passed the legislature, and so he was able to stay here, have a land claim, and he eventually founded the town of Centralia, well, with Centerville in those days. And Roger's holding a copy of the original town plat where George Washington and his wife Mary Jane actually wrote out a document giving land for the town of Centralia, and they also laid out the town park, which is where we're standing right now. So George Washington was indeed the founder of Centralia and a very important man, and it's really important to the history of this territory that a black man was allowed to live here.
Would you like to come on in? So many of the travelers do, and I know you're probably tired from your long journey. Come on in and look at the house. This stove came across and around the horn, and Joseph ordered it for me. And he said, you just can order anything you want, and it kept things warm at the top. This is the way we make our pancakes. Of course, they have to cook on one side, and then they have to cook on the other side. And a nice iron that you can heat up and that you can iron. Right here was my ironing board. Oh, I ironed all of the girls' things and all of Joseph's things on this ironing board. And the pie cooler. You know, I have so many modern things here. This is something where I can make out all my pies and I make my bread from, and everything is so handy.
Oh, this is where I want you to come because this is where company Ulysses S. Grant and the first territorial governor, they ate in this dining room right here at this table. All of these chairs were made for us up at Chambers Prairie. I'd like to show you a picture of the family now. This is myself and this is Joseph. And these are the two girls, Ada and Eva. And then that's not Harbin, but that's our baby, David. And then over here are the three children in the order they were born. Now, this is Eva, and she's a little smaller, but she takes after my side, the Roundtrees. And that's Ada, and she looks like a Boris. She looks just like Joseph. And Joseph was there in the blockhouse, and he helped deliver her. He was the only one that helped deliver her when we lived in the blockhouse before we built the house. And there's Harbin, our son. Oh, there's so many good times, but there's bad times too. And I suppose you saw the little cemetery out beside the house. And that's where our 4 children were buried. And I was so sad during that time. And Joseph tried to cheer me up, and he adopted a little girl. And even the little girl died. This is my favorite room. Now, I didn't let the children come in here too often, but this is my favorite room. And there you can see Joseph and my pictures on the wall, and my table, and again the lamp to light the room up. And this chair was made for me exactly. That's of Chambers Prairie. They sat down and he made it just for me. Of course, we have to have a little heat in every room, so we have to have the stove going. There's the parlor, but that was the men's smoking room. And they had a door there and a door there. I did not want them smoking in my house, right here in my room. It was always so stale and so smoky. So that was the men's smoking room. And they crowded all around, and then I bowed my head and my hat fell off, and they could see it was me, and they laughed and laughed, and I was always pulling jokes like that. I just loved that. But later on, we made this into Joseph's office, and he would do his work here at this desk. And I just remember this was his stamp. And, oh, there's so many memories in this room. After Joseph died, I had to take over the farm, and I had to run it myself. And I always signed my name M. Borst, because I didn't want them to know I was a woman. They discriminate against women, and I didn't want them to know that. This is a tintype picture of the house, and what I loved about it was there was a balcony on top that I could walk out from our bedroom, and then there was the big front porch, and I would sit there and I would watch all the people coming by on what was used to be the Cowlitz road, and then later it became the military road because Ulysses S. Grant laid it out. It was good because Indians first, pioneers next, and then all of the many people who came by our door.
Karen, Roger, I'd like to show you a marker here that was placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1916. It was one of 12 placed on the Cowlitz Trail between Vancouver and Olympia. And this one was erected in 1916. Those that worked on it with the Daughters of the American Revolution were Ezra Meeker, Hazard Stevens, son of Isaac Stevens, George Himes, who was the director, secretary of the Oregon Historical Society in the early 1900s. So from here we're going to take a look at the location where the military or territorial road crossed the Chehalis River and met up with the Cowlitz Trail. And I have a picture here taken early on of the Borst home and the Borst blockhouse showing the Chehalis River, and the ferry that is not shown in this picture crossed the river here, and wagons came up this location that we call a dugway, and then on to the north. This is from the south side of the river looking north. So from here we're going to go over to the north bank of the Chehalis River and see the remaining signs of that dugway. Here we see the remains of the dugway that showed so prominently in the picture, and you can notice that there were few trees in those days. Today there's brush, there's fir trees during the intervening 140 years. And you can see the dugway where the wagons came up, and this is the military road. It came from Monticello area up the west side of the Cowlitz River to this location across the Chehalis River on a ferry, and then from here proceeded north to Ford's Prairie and on to Olympia. From here we're going to go over and take a look at the blockhouse, which was originally at this location, but due to flooding and river channel changes over the years, it was relocated to Forest Park here in Centralia. And we're going to go there now and take a look at that blockhouse. At the Borst Blockhouse, and this was built not at this location but near the Borst home in 1855-56 during the Indian concerns. It was moved here by the city of Centralia to avoid the shifting waters of the Chehalis River, and it was never used as a military post blockhouse as you might think. It was for storage.
Yeah, that's right, Chuck. It was used as grain storage for the military's horses when they were planning their campaign against the Indians in 55 and 56. But the city's taken good care of it, and we're glad that it's still an artifact that remains. Let's see, I think now we're going to go off and go up north the trail a little bit to Ford's Prairie, where Ford's house is, and or was, and we'll take a look at that.
And that's where Sidney Ford and his family settled, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, let's go up there and take a look.
Well, here we are on the Sidney S. Ford donation land claim, what's left of it, because it has been broken up by different owners over the years. We have with us today Lola Ritter Bowen Stansel, who is a descendant of Sidney Ford. And Lola, thanks a lot for coming out today on such a hot day. Can you tell us a little bit about your family's history?
A little. You asked me why you think he came this far away from the road, because they had to be next to a water supply for the household, and then they also traveled on this river as much as they did, or maybe more than they did on the underdeveloped roads.
Okay.
He did a lot of traveling, and they left New York in 1845. I mean, they left New York, and then they came to St. Joseph, Missouri in 1845, and they crossed the plains with another family, group of families, and a herd of cattle, 6 children, one of them only less than 6 months old. And he was Indian agent for the Northwest. He was a legislator. He was a Indian agent, county commissioner, and he also signed the treaty of, is that a treaty of Monticello?
Oh, the convention, Monticello Convention.
Yeah, he signed the paper there that to make this area into Washington Territory. And when they started out on the wagon train, they had my great-grandmother, who was Elizabeth. And the first few days out, she lost her shoes on a bonfire. And so she had to walk across the United States barefoot,
And
behind a covered wagon.
And how old was she at
4
the time?
years old. And we know she did because the mother had 2 babies on her lap. She had one 2-year-old and one 6 months. When the Ford family came to the Cowlitz River, the stock, the men took the stock all across and they drove them, while the women and children were loaded into canoes. And as they were ready to leave with the loaded canoes across the, down the river, up the river, I guess they came, Elizabeth was gone, and they couldn't find her. And after a while, they decided that she had drowned, and they sadly came up the river. And at the next landing, there sat Elizabeth on the bank with her Indian friend and a loaded canoe. She had caught a ride with him, and that was her first encounter with Native Americans. Then, well, she lost her shoes. I told you about that. And then I was so impressed with the Ford family and my great-grandmother that I went on a bicentennial wagon train across the United States. And I ended up at St. Joseph, Missouri, and then I decided to go on to New York full circle. So I did that. I went to the White House and saw the president, and then I also went to New York because I especially wanted to be where they had been. While I was on my trip, I compared. There was 2 different days that I compared with Sidney Ford and me. The first one, we were coming up a hill, and I was on the back of a covered wagon, and I could look down the hill and I could see a field of cattle and just the tops of their backs, and I was just kind of looking. And then I saw, about 17 wagons, and each one had a bearded man or a lady that was dressed appropriately and driving. And then each one had a horse-drawn covered wagon, and on each side was outriders. There had to be an outrider or 2 with each wagon. And then I heard the teamster say, "Look," and I looked and I see the mast of a ship, and it didn't look like it belonged there because it was right in the middle of a field or on a little hill. And when we got to the top of the hill, there was a ship, and it was loading logs. And next to that was a railroad track. And then next to that was a highway. And a freeway that was completely loaded with buses and motorhomes and shiny cars and everything that you see on a loaded highway. And then when I looked overhead, there went a jet with a plume behind it. And I thought, the history of transportation, and Sidney Ford didn't get to see it. Then the next place was at the top of the Great Divide. And I was sitting up there at night, I was looking at the stars and the moon and the rocks and the trees and the ground, and I thought, this is what Sidney Ford saw. Also, at the same time, there was a sign on the creek that said, "Don't drink the water." Now, then I remembered that's where Sidney Ford was when his cattle got poisoned. And all the cattle that didn't get bacon grease or bacon shoved down their throat, the ones that didn't died.
Now, why is that, Lola? Did the grease coat their stomachs, probably?
Yes, I never looked it up, but that's what they said happened. And then I thought about the meal that I had that day. Wonderful, wonderful food, and it was some barbecued the day before and some wonderful food that next day. And what they had, boiled wheat and salt pork.
So even though you traveled across the country in a covered wagon, just like Sidney Ford did. You had it a little bit better.
I had it a little bit better. And I might add that I have lived within a mile of the Cowlitz Trail all my life. Almost all my life, because I've gone a little bit.
Well, I know you've seen this photo before, but I'm going to let you hold it. And this is a photo of Sidney Ford and his wife Nancy.
Yes.
And you told me a nice story about Nancy, that when she came out here, she was kind of lonely.
She went a whole year without seeing a white woman. And she was so happy when the traders came and the new settlers came and brought their family and their children.
Now, even though we're here on the banks of the Chehalis River, and we know that this whole acreage around here was Ford's original land claim, and I think we've kind of figured out where his original house was, even though there's nothing left of it today.
Yes.
Right? And maybe we can walk over a little bit and try to find out where that was.
All right.
Okay. So Lola, I understand that on Ford's land claim, there are these benches or flat spots that come up from the river, and you can see the little rise here as land comes up in little floodplains. And somewhere's up in that grove of oaks, we figure, as close as we can, was Sidney's house.
Yes. They told me that it was just about up here. And that is what only thing I've ever heard.
Okay, and we do have a sketch here that was done in 1859 of the Ford house when it was still a log cabin. He later built the big framed house, right?
Yes.
The big white house. But this was done by an artist named James Gilchrist Swan, who is rather famous in this part of the country in the 1850s and later. And he did a very nice pencil sketch of the house while he was kind of a secretary for Governor Stevens during the Indian Treaty negotiations. So we assume that that house was up here on the higher bench someplace. And now that we've learned about your history and the Ford family history, we're going to go down the road to some people that your ancestors knew, the James family from Grand Mound.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can come along if you want to.
Well, we'll see.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're at Jamestown, and we're privileged to have with us Margaret Horton, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Samuel James, one of the first people in the area. And she has a diary, or an excerpt from a diary that she's going to read about the travels up down the Cowlitz Trail. And Margaret?
Hi, I would like to tell you that this is taken from the autobiography of John Rogers James, who, when they came across the Oregon Trail, was 11 years old at the time. And this is his account of coming from Milwaukee, Oregon territory to Grand Mound Prairie, Oregon territory. Father made arrangements with Dr. McLaughlin at Oregon City for the use of one of the Hudson's Bay trading boats, a bateau. I should judge it to be 7 or 8 ton capacity. I took my first lessons in caulking as we repaired the old boat on the shore of the Willamette opposite the town of Oswego. Rowing down the Columbia, we arrived at the Cowlitz the third day. Father hired 6 Indians to use poles and paddle us up the Cowlitz landing. Father got Indians to pull and push and pole the big bateau up the swift current. The Indians understood handling the unwieldy boat in the swift water to perfection. The second day on the Cowlitz, we arrived at the landing and were met there by the 3 brothers with the cattle. The wagons were unloaded from the boat, put together and reloaded, and we moved on to Mr. John R. Jackson's farm, where we were welcomed as though we were relatives newly arrived. Mr. Jackson had a well-equipped farm with plenty of all kinds of farm products and stock. We occupied the first cabin Mr. Jackson had built some years before, as he had built a more plenteous cabin which was afterward christened as the first courthouse in the territory of Washington. The second reading talks about Grand Mound Prairie, October 12, 1852. We came to anchor here. Yoking up the cattle this morning at Mr. Joe Borst's place, we leisurely drove through 2 miles of woods separating Ford's Prairie from the big prairie that had the big mound upon it. Turning off to the left of the road, 2.5 miles to the west, there was a little log cabin, looking lonely and forsaken on the big prairie, with big, tall timbers 250 to 300 feet high on the river bottom. Just below the bank, about 30 feet of an elevation, were 2 large springs of good water. Also, quite a body of open land in the river bottom from the bank where the cabin stood, 1.5 miles west of the mound itself, in the middle of Section 9, Township 15 North, Range 3 West. An Indian village was on the bank of the river where it washes right up to the prairie. Near the mound, and 1/2 mile east of the cabin, were 2 families of Indians, the Hatsuit and the Wee-I-Wee families. Next day, Father sent one of the boys to bring Brother Samuel and Thomas and one of the teams and wagon back up at what is known as the Tilley donation claim, as he had concluded this was a more desirable spot and was anxious to get settled as winter was not far off. With the big ox teams, a plow, and something of an outfit to work with, and 4 boys to help, he commenced breaking the prairie and fencing so that the place soon looked as if somebody were living there. Strangers would remark to Father how well he was getting along with the improvements.
That was wonderful, and maybe we could take a look in Ye Old Granary, 1884, and see some of the artifacts that you have from the family.
Certainly, come on in. On the one side, we have a number of original photos that were taken. For example, this photo was taken while they had been digging potatoes, and a photographer came through, and this was brand new, and the family posed for this picture along with 3 natives. And in the far back, the little lady is Anna Maria James, Samuel's wife. I believe possibly at this time Samuel was deceased. And then there are several pencil ink type drawings that were done by some by my father, others by some cousins. My father was Charles James, brother to David James, and our great-grandparents are here in this picture with Samuel James II and Clara Heel. The ox yoke up on the rafters is one of the ox yokes that was used when they did come across the plains on the Oregon Trail, and my dad was able to have that and preserve it. Other things that are on the wall, many of these were old implements for farming and logging and such that were in a barn that belonged to Samuel James I's grandson. And when that barn was about to collapse, a number of these things were retrieved and are now here, and we have had this museum in our family for a number of years. This particular building has moved a lot due to my father's having had possession of it and then moving from Jamestown to Rochester and then back to Jamestown. So it has moved a bit, and it is on the Historical Society. I think that that's pretty much self-explanatory. This was a kayak that my dad used to have, and my dad passed away several years ago. And he really treasured everything in this building.
Here we are at the site of Fort Hennis, which was a fortification built for the settlers' protection during the Indian troubles of 1855-56. It's out here near Rochester, Washington, and if we walk over this way, we can see the site of the fort in the background, even though there's not much here. And Roger, maybe you can explain the map that lays out the fort.
Well, this is a map that shows a location of where living quarters, barracks, the school, and the various little cabins for all the different people that lived within the blockhouse. And you can see some of the names of some of the people. You're going to recognize several of these probably from some of the places that we've been already.
We are here at Fort Hennis, like Karen said just a moment ago, and we saw the site where Fort Hennis is, and this is a model replica of the fort constructed by Charles James, whose ancestors settled in the Grand Mound area and founded Jamestown. Fort Hennis was constructed during the 1855-56 Indian concerns, and it was occupied from October of 1855 for the next 22 months. And during that period there were about 220 people that occupied the fort. Some of the names we saw earlier that we recognize, people currently living in this area.
Chuck, I wanted to show you this picture of Captain Hennis himself, Benjamin Hennis, and his wife, and he was the person for whom the fort was named.
That's correct. Benjamin was a captain in the Volunteer Army, Militia, and the fort was named in his honor.
From here at Fort Hennis, the Cowlitz Trail angles northeast towards what is now the town of Tenino, and we're going to head up the trail and see a few stops along the way. So let's head out. Jan, good morning. How are you doing?
Just great, and welcome to the Erickson Farmstead. Come right in.
Good. It's nice of you to have us out on such a cold, foggy morning.
Well, we lived in Washington. It was cold and foggy for our pioneer ancestors also.
You know, on our trip up the Cowlitz Trail, we've already visited the town of Coquito, and you're a descendant of the Davis family, which founded the town. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Okay. I'm a great-great-granddaughter of Lewis Hawkins Davis and Susan Klinger Davis. Goodness, they came all the way from Windsor County, Vermont, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Fort Wayne, Indiana, over the Oregon Trail in 1851, arriving in Oregon City or Portland about October 26th of 1851. There was a great deal of sickness there, and so they moved right away up the Cowlitz Trail, up the Columbia to Huntington's at Monticello at that time, and then on up for 6 months to the Hudson's Bay farm at, just past Cowlitz Landing. And they were there 6 months while they searched around for a place to live. Mr. Davis, Lewis Davis, found Schuyler Saunders in Chehalis, the present day Chehalis, who had told him about Coquito Hill. It was a prairie that the Indians had kept cleared over, and so he decided to move his family from Hudson's Bay Cowlitz Farm up the Cowlitz Trail to Saundersville, and from there they needed to cut their way through the brush and tall trees. It would be 2 miles west, it was, from Saundersville, evidently ferrying all of their goods across the Chehalis River in order to get to the hill. At that time there was an Indian encampment at the base of the hill. They were always friendly and helpful to the Davises. One of the first things that they did was build a log cabin for their family. There were 6 children with them at this time, and Lewis Davis was nearly 60 years old when he arrived there, but he had a dream that his little town would be the center of the area's population. So he went to work and built roads 6 miles south to Fort Worst. Of course, the fort wasn't built at that time. And the next year, 1853, I think that was, with the help of neighbors, they built roads 9 miles to McDonald's Prairie, which was the present-day Napa line. And over these roads came more settlers. They were invited to camp under the pioneer fir tree, which now sits in Clequedo Cemetery. It is an absolutely amazing tree that still stands today.
Well, Jan, I understand that some of the roads that Lewis Hawkins and his sons built, his 5 sons, became part of the Cowlitz Trail and the military road, and one of these runs over your current property.
Well, it's kind of an offshoot off of that military road, but Alan's grandparents called it the military road, and we think it came from Fort Hennis into Olympia.
Okay.
Because goods came by ship into Olympia and would have been transported by wagon down to Fort Hennis.
Okay, well, since we're all bundled up today anyway, I understand Alan, your husband, is going to take us out and show us a little bit of the trail that's left and some other artifacts on the property.
That'd be super.
Okay, well, we'll go find him now.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
Jan.
Alan, we were just talking to your wife, and she was telling us about her connection with the Lewis Davis at Clequedo.
Right.
And the house that we see here, as I understand, belonged to your grandparents. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, my grandparents came in 1893 here. They had already purchased 80 acres in 1890. In 93, they moved out here. They came from Tacoma by rail to Little Rock. Then they came over to what they called the wagon trail and came down to this location. And the trail is just behind us. The house faced the trail, so it was turned a quarter, just this first section. And then when the automobiles came into play, they couldn't even back up the hill in the wintertime. So they had to have another route. So Grandpa and others donated the present location of the Case Road. So then Grandpa turned the house around the way it is now, and we came in from the other side.
Do you have any idea how he turned the house around?
I don't know. The technology that they had at that time was such that they could do it.
Okay, now you're going to show us where the military road was through the property.
Right.
Okay, let's go take a look at that now.
All right.
Walk off.
This is a section of the trail that it was only wagons could go up with horses. So when the Model Ts and A's came on the scene and they wanted to come up in the wintertime, there's no way they could make it up, even turning around and going backwards, which was a trick that they had to gain momentum. The trees, the kids at the base of here was the first little schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse, and the girls especially, coming from the other side of the hill here, came through these woods and were rather scared because of the big trees that they had to go through to get to school. But I've maintained this, and
this is really quite steep for a wagon.
Yeah.
And especially for a Model T or later. I understand that you have a relic that you would like to show us that belonged to your grandparents?
yes, the buggy that they took to Tenino to get supplies. Shall we
Good.
go back to the house?
Let's go back and take a look at that.
Okay.
Okay, I understand this is your grandparents' wagon or buggy.
Yes, it's the one that they used to go to Tenino to get supplies and bring back. This is a ginkgo that was planted in memory of my aunt that passed away a few years ago. We're on the Thurston County Historical Register as a typical Scandinavian farmstead, and I put it in an irrevocable living trust for 3 generations. So our intent is to maintain this farm as it is.
Do you have any idea where the wagon was built?
No, I don't, but they generally were built back east.
And you've maintained it in this condition in all these years.
It's been in the barn.
Beautiful, beautiful buggy.
Shall we see the plaque they have on the house? We put that on this summer as part of our annual family picnic that we hold here at the little lake that we have. And so everybody got to take pictures of themselves holding the plaque.
Good. Let's go take a look at the plaque.
I wanted to try and put it on a piece of granite that we have out here by this maple tree to see whether I'd rather have it there than mounted on the house, but I haven't yet drilled the holes for the lag bolts.
Hey, Al, thank you very much for a tour of your property and the trail and the buggy, and we're on our way now to visit another site on the Cowlitz Trail. Take
Great.
care.
Well, I'm glad to have you at our farmstead.
Thank you very much.
It's our pleasure.
We're now at the COLVIN house, which is just south of Tenino, and it was a stage stop at one time, it is believed, and it would be very close to the trail. Some of the early COLVINs referenced the trail coming through this property. We're going to meet Doris COLVIN, who's going to explain further. Good morning, Mrs. COLVIN.
Hello there.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
We'd like to talk to you about Ignatius COLVIN, one of the early pioneers in the area, and I understand you have some things to show us.
Well, if you want to come on in, we'll take a look and see what we have.
Thank you. I want to draw your attention to a portrait of Ignatius COLVIN here on the table. He was a very interesting man and is very well known in South Thurston County area. And Doris is going to read something about him.
I'm going to read you some of the early history of the COLVIN Ranch. The first generation was Ignatius COLVIN. He was a native of Boone County, Missouri. First came west as a driver of a U.S. government commissary wagon destined for Fort Vancouver. He later made his way northward to Tumwater, then to the Grand Mound area, where he took up a donation land claim of 320 acres on Scatter Creek in 1854. Prior to taking up the land, COLVIN had been captured by Indians in the Queen Charlotte Islands with a group of other adventurers on a gold prospecting trip. The group, after being held as slaves for several months, were ransomed by the government for a reported $15,000. He lived on the 320 acres until the Indian War of 1855-56. At that time, he joined the volunteer militia and served through the uprising. He returned to the ranch after the war, enlarged it to approximately 3,000 acres, and acquired 3 farms in Lewis County.
I see you also have some documents. I would think it'd be very unusual or rare that people would have such original documents as you have displayed here. We can see the one that we're looking at right here.
Yes. That was the Colvin house, yeah, after the turn of the century.
Looks very much as it does today. The house was built in 1877?
I believe that's the earliest record that we have, yes.
And you have heard that it was a stage stop, and do you have any information?
I have been told by my husband that it used to be a stage stop. The original house was built, I believe, in 1877, and then a section was added onto it later.
And so there must have been some trail or something that came nearby in order for this to be a stage stop.
We believe that the trail, whether it was the Oregon Trail or the stagecoach stop, and maybe it's one and the same thing, is out across the prairie, about halfway across between here and Old Highway 99. There used to be a kind of ruts out there that you could see, but over the years those have eroded, and machinery and things that have gone across the prairie. I don't know whether you can see them anymore.
I'd like to go and look.
Well, you're welcome to.
Thank you. Well,
can
thank
do
you
that.
so much for sharing with us all of this wonderful documentation. We were just about to leave when Doris's daughter Margaret came in with a remarkable beaded bag. Margaret, could you tell us something about that bag?
Well, this bag was given to me by my father, and he indicated that it was beaded by Indians who had lived and worked on the property here.
And you mentioned Indians working on the property. Doris, you made a comment a minute ago about that too. What do you know about the Indians that were here?
I don't know what tribe they would belong to or anything like that. They had an encampment, I understand. They camped, and they worked on the farm, and I understand that they received wages, but they were well taken care of by Ignatius Colvin. He saw that they survived the winters, and so they were here in those early days. That's about all I can tell you on that.
Well, you have here another artifact. What do you know about that?
This was evidently hand carved out by the Indians, one of their utensils. And it looks to me like it was meant to be a soup bowl or some sort of an eating, to take the place of a plate or a saucer or something they could eat from.
And
it's beautifully carved.
Where did you find that? Was that just passed down, or did?
This was just found in the upstairs part of this house. There was actually 4 bedrooms up there, and over the years they became like an attic or a storage space. And in going through some of the things up there, we found the old documents, and we found a few things like this.
That's
and the beaded
wonderful.
bags, I believe, that my daughter talked about.
And you brought out something else here that, as an ex-school teacher, you are, and I am too, really interested me. This is some records from 1862 of Coal Bank District, which was Tenino, and just thumbing through that, we saw many names that we recognize from history of the area. That's a real treasure. You might look at the cover of that. It has that 1860s look to it. And there are some other registers here of people that went to school in the early days of the area. I want to thank both of you very much for sharing all this with us. And we're about now to go to an interesting geological feature called the Mima Mounds, which was part of the trail. We'll talk about that though when we get there.
We're about a mile southwest of Tenino, and this is where the Cowlitz Trail leaves Old Highway 99 on its way towards Tenino. You can see straight ahead there's a paved area where over the years it's been slightly improved. We've talked a lot about Ezra Meeker and many of our musings of the Cowlitz Trail. Ezra in 1906 started on his eastward journey to bring back the remnants and the history of the trail, and this is the first marker that he placed. This one is in Tenino, Washington. It reads Old Oregon Trail, 1845-53. And this is the one that he placed shortly after leaving his home in Puyallup in early 1906. The dates on the stone are significant. They depend upon the location. 1845 was the year the first American pioneers settled in the Puget Sound area. And of course, 1853 is when Washington became a territory.
We're here at the Mima Mounds, just a little bit north of Tenino, and the trail would have come through this area, pretty close to where Old 99 is. And I have a mystery for you. We're going to stop just a second and mention the fact that for many, many years, over 100 years, this area out here, known as the Mima Prairie, has been an enigma. It's been a real puzzle for people. In fact, we know that even back in the times of the Wilkes expedition, there was some notification or some documentation of these mounds. But before we talk about them directly, I want to just tell you about a few facts about them. And I'm going to leave the mystery up to you, the viewer, to see if you can figure out or come up with some kind of an answer to what we're seeing. They're not found anywhere else in the world in this form. And there are 35 square miles of them, and they all travel from about a northeast to a southwest direction. If you'll notice in them, there are some areas where there are no mounds, but they're sort of lined up. And in any one area, they seem to be pretty much the same size. Now, knowing that, let's go back to the time of John Wilkes and have a look at a Paul Kane representation that was done in the 1840s of this area. And even then, they didn't have any idea of what these are. From the beginning, some of the theories were that they were anything from ancient fish mounds or the mounds of pocket gophers, or some people thought that they were Indian ceremonial mounds that were made for some kind of ceremonial purpose. Some people thought they were even Indian grave sites. There was even a theory purported by some people that the Chinese, while they were building the railroad through this area, stopped long enough to pan for gold, and these are the tailings of their pannings. And then some people think that this is a result of a glacial system that went through. We had 3 large glaciers that went through the area. Now I'd like to show you another picture taken from the air of these mounds. And as you can see, there's a real pattern to them. So we know that historically they were mentioned in the Wilkes expedition notes, in the Hudson's Bay journals. Many of the pioneers saw these, and although they were more interested, obviously, to get where they were going, they weren't too concerned about what these were. So, and then even Louis Agassiz, who was a Swiss glaciologist, came through here, and he was the one that said these were ancient fish mounds. Now I'm going to leave it to you to see what you think. But imagine what the pioneers and all the others thought when they came through this area and finding something they'd never seen before. Now we're going to head a little bit farther north on the trail and see some other remnants left from that time.